Well, welcome, Andrew.
Welcome. Thank you.
Welcome to me back.
Yeah. Here we are again.
Yeah. So I think this is our fifth.
I think it is. Who would have thought?
Cross and creation. And last time you and Lisa did a
Oh,
great job
yeah.
on Genesis 22.
That was fun.
Fun. Well, tonight, what we're going to do is Andrew and I are going to have a sort of look through history, the development of the idea of penal substitution. I don't think we can pretend that we're historians. I don't think we can pretend that we could, give a adequate coverage of the development of a major theme through 2,000 years. But I think the main flows are relatively clear, and particularly what I'd call the pivot around Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century. And we'll actually focus a lot of hymns
On Anselm.
On Anselm. So, but as always, I think it's worthwhile just stepping back and recalling what we're trying to do, which is really a paradigm shift around the nature of atonement and whatever that means. And in that context, really going back to Genesis 1 and saying, well, if we started in Genesis 1 with creation and we looked from creation to the cross, what would that look like? We did note that there's a little bit of an either or between those two parties. Sometimes that the theologians of the church have focused on creation and tended not to focus on the cross, or that's the criticism.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think the modern Protestant evangelical world would go the other way, which is no, our focus is on the cross, and the focus on creation or natural grace is a little bit
subdued
and idealistic. So we think our goal is to integrate those two things. So let me begin. I think it's good if we just have a little bit of a discussion on where our thinking is so far, because it's true to say that we're seeing our own thinking develop.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what would be, as you look back where we've come, how would you summarise the thoughts or the things that have mattered to you?
Yeah. Well, I think the starting point, like, it's great to start at Genesis 1, but when you start passing through Genesis 3, how you describe Adam's sin, and the chapter doesn't mention the word sin, is, I think, sets you off on a trajectory. So a lot of our systematic theologies will say Adam broke God's moral law, where what we're saying is, no, he didn't trust God in a relationship. He didn't trust God's benevolence. And so it was a relational problem. So I think that starting point sets the tone for where everything else will
not
go.
just sets the tone, it's almost like a slight deviation of a few degrees. Depending which road you take, you're going to end up going down quite different paths.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that from the very first of these sessions, you reframed Adam's sin as not believing that God intended good
toward him.
We'd like to I think it's worthwhile recalling that, because that's quite a paradigm shift.
It is quite a paradigm shift. And as I said, I think because of certain theories, and they're just theories, about the atonement, people have had to backfill their theology and find more and more legal stuff to be broken so it can be fixed, right? If you've got an atonement theory that says a law's been broken, then you've got to put the law there to be broken, where it's not in the text. And Jewish people don't tend to talk in those terms. And when you look in the text at exactly what happened, Adam simply didn't trust that God intended good towards him, and thought there was a better way, and took advice from elsewhere. That at a really rudimentary level is what happened.
Well, that's powerful. When I heard you talk about that even tonight, I think we'd had a discussion before this. I think a lot of people would see that, characterised the Genesis 3 sin as rebellion.
Yeah,
that's a very big word, and very often I've seen it's pride.
Yep. Yes.
And of course, they're interpretations of the text. But if you start with what you've just said, if in a human relationship, I don't trust the other person wants good for me, what I then become is independent.
Yeah.
I'll cut myself off from that person. And that's, I think, a better way to look at the so-called pride is independence. It's because no longer do I believe in the providence around me and the created order. I don't believe in that. It's up to me now. So,
and when you've got a God who the metaphors that are used all through the Old Testament is the bridegroom. It's a relationship. Amazingly, the metaphors at least are very, very equal, where rebellion assumes that it's not an equal relationship.
It almost assumes there needs to even be one.
Yeah, that's right. And so we've been saying that when God says he is holy, that means he's radically different. And God is always saying, I'm different to the gods of the surrounding nations. So that's why I thought it was important to do Genesis 22. Once you realize our God's different to other gods, he's not built in our image. And maybe he wants a different sort of relationship with us, which you see in the metaphors.
I think the despotic idea of God, rebellion, he's not on our side and he doesn't trust good for us. Of course, I think Tom Wright would say that is paganizing.
Yep.
That is a fundamentally pagan view of God, that the cosmology of the ancient Near Eastern world, which Ian Provan and John Walton have taught us so much about, is that the gods do not intend good for us. We don't know quite what they intend in their case, if anything at all. But one thing's for sure, they're not on our side.
Yeah.
And I think that is deep in the human heart, some sense of we all grapple with it, doom. It's me against fate, and of course the inimitable words of King Lear on the heath. As flies to wanton boys, so are we to the god. They kill us for their sport. The sense I'm in an indifferent world, and that indifference essentially is there is not good in the world. So, with that, I think it's very important. Perhaps one talk back, two talks back. New word we also introduced was this idea of, when I do go back to creation and the goal of relationship, the next thing down is the mission and the role of humanity in the created order. And that's where you introduced us to the idea of dominion. And we talked about mission failure rather than mission. So do you want to just recall that?
It's a very bold thing to say. I introduced dominion. I think the text introduced dominion. And look, if you've got a view that God's sovereign and can play this game any way he likes, then it raises the question: why bother with a creation? Why is it necessary? Why bother? Because presumably, if he could have, if it worked for his plans and purposes, he could know how everyone's going to turn out and just put those ideas in our head at the end and fast track, save us from the whole tedium of struggle here and just cut to the end, but he doesn't. So it's not hard to assume that there must be something purposeful about this creation, and there is something that we do in this creation that gets us to be more like whatever God wants us to be like. And the term that's used is he gives us dominion. So I assume that it's us taking that creative role is part of the way that we grow into the sorts of people who can sit around the banquet table for eternity with Jesus and be entertaining guests.
There's much to be said about that, but I think it's really, there's a few important things. The way you've just been talking is by a series of rhetorical questions.
Yeah.
And very interestingly, that's exactly how Anselm proceeds. Yeah. I like that about him a lot, because I think they're questions that you can't be glib about. They're real questions. It's a real question. And we Christians, unfortunately, tend to take doctrine as cliche and don't think about it. But when we get to Anselm, the dialogue that he sets up is between himself and Bozo.
Not
Bozo's a puke appears.
a clown.
No, he's no clown. And
No.
as a matter of fact, I find Bozo's questions, which sometimes he develops over 2 pages to Anselm, intriguing. And I actually was really inspired because he's taking in the 11th century the view of the unbeliever. This is stupid. Why would this happen? You can't tell me this. And Anselm's got to find answers to him that actually never come from scripture. I won't get on that now, but I think it's interesting. And that question you asked is one of the ones he asked.
All right.
Why can't God just do it by decree?
Yeah.
Why does he have to go ahead and die? And now most Christians would say, oh, well, if you can't answer that question, you can't really talk about the gospel. And if you've never thought about that as a question, you can't talk about the gospel. So that's that one. I think the other point about dominion, 2 points I wanted to make, is evidently far more important as an attribution of the victory of Christ to Paul than it is to modern believers.
Okay.
Far more important.
Yeah.
Modern believers say, well, he forgive us our sin. Paul rarely says that. If you read Ephesians 1, which I was doing again this morning, it's all about when he raised from the dead, gave him a name above every name, above all dominion, authority. It's dominion he's got.
He's got,
And that's Hebrews is exactly the same. It's dominion he's got. When we read, he will inherit all things. He will inherit dominion. When Paul says blessed, he's blessed. Then he's wanting us to share in that dominion. So this idea of dominion, I think, has been sidelined in a lot of evangelical thought in place of forgiveness. But it's clearly the most casual reading of the New Testament, far more important in Paul's cosmology. So we haven't got his cosmology.
No.
I think the dominion, what you're doing in taking us back to the mission of humanity, is important. And the final thing I'll say about it is there's 2 ways you can describe a problem. One is kind of going back to the problem, but the other is looking at the problem as a failure to achieve a purpose. In which case I've now talked about a purpose, which is what you've done.
And I think what we tend to do when it comes to dominion is we assume that our dominion ceased totally at the fall. And so a lot of theological debate is about decisions or beliefs you have about continuity between parts of scripture, pre-fall, post-fall, eternity, and what actually happened. And I think without thoughtlessly, a lot of people go, because of the fall, those things that occurred in Genesis 1 don't count anymore, where they still do. They, as you say, Paul picks up on it.
Right. So history and why that's important. I want to make probably 3 points about why our approach, why we think history is important. When I say think history is important, what I mean is putting anybody, including the New Testament, but including later people like Luther, into their historical context. And I think it's the only way to be fair to people. The only way to be fair to Augustine and people you disagree with. Simply because it's in the nature of human beings to formulate their ideas in opposition to other ideas. And so if you don't understand the ideas they're in opposition to, you can't understand them. And secondly, when we do that, and my wife will tell you I'm really bad at doing that, it tends to polarize your point of view. It pushes you to actually an extreme position, which is a reflex against what.
So we're defined by what we oppose.
And I think so. And I think there's nothing wrong with this. Where God's put us into history, he's put us. But I think, we've got a hit context in our world where we have to do the same thing. And then as well as that, I think when we're looking at atonement, we treasure the idea of we're looking at a mystery, which is looked at perspectively. And at the very, very least, the penal substitutionary model is one perspective that has over monopolized. That's probably
just a theory.
Well, it's not just.
It should be just a theory.
My point is, no reality. We are human beings who are struggling not struggling. Yeah, we always use analogy
Yeah.
to describe reality. Reality is, for me to say E equals MC squared is an analogy.
Yeah.
I mean, reality is not E equals MC squared, it's something else. So therefore, this is not to be despairing, but to acknowledge that, well, critiquing the analogies we might use is illuminating and getting good ones and bad ones. And I think I was going to deal with your point, Ron. I'm going to now quote quantum mechanics. So I get along.
Oh, yes.
But we tend to think the nature of reality is mechanistic and clear and precise, whereas what you've taught us, Ron, about quantum mechanics is actually the more you get down to the nature of the building blocks of reality, the more that they're not building blocks. And so that we're the nature of reality upon which everything concrete sits seems to be extremely mysterious, such that, as Ron has explained it to me, the mathematics can only be on probabilities. We can't actually map the pathway of the atoms in the split view experiment. So if that's mysterious, if this table's mysterious, one could be, you can say, well, probably the cross and the redemption of the entire cosmos is also a bit mysterious. So we'll be humble about it.
Yeah, and you'd assume, if it was really important to God, that we understand exactly how the mechanism worked, and he could, he'd explain it that way, which raises two issues. One, you're probably right. Maybe it's a little bit beyond our experience. So there's not a vocabulary to explain it. So you've got to use metaphors. It's a rather unique thing to occur in history. So that it shouldn't surprise us that we've got to resort to metaphor.
Yeah, the way I look at it, it's very positive. If I want you to understand something, I'll make you work at it.
Yeah.
I'm not going to give it to you on a platter.
That's right.
And I'm a teacher. That's what I do. I'm going to make you work at it.
Absolutely.
And I think God wants us to work at it. So at every generation, you've got to have a go at it. And that's actually, you come out deeper and richer in your understanding, because God does want understanding. There's no question about that.
Yep.
It's just that the kind of understanding he's offering us is not a total mastery. Anyway, we should move on. I think we all agree that we in Gospel Conversations are happy swimming in the fog of ambiguity.
Yeah.
Okay. That having been said, we were going to look at 4 eras tonight, but really only one of them in depth. So the Apostolic era, New Testament, we'll just mention a bit about that. That was then followed by the patristic era, which would be next 200 to 300 years. And the patristics' view of atonement is very, very important. And I think they had the most illuminated picture of it. Then we'll look at Anselm, who, as I said, lived in the 11th century. And clearly, this was a major pivot, crystallization of what became penal substitution. He didn't actually call it that, but nonetheless, a lot of the mechanisms and assumptions, the logic that he put in place.
Yep.
So Anselm, and that's what we'll, because he's a...
So it just means there's a football game starting somewhere in the world. Probably Melbourne.
You want to tell us the score?
Maybe.
So that's actually, I think it's really valuable, given he's pivotal, to really get inside him, and most of the time will do that. And then the Reformers. And which is Luther and co. We won't say too much about them. I think it's fair enough to say they were picking up the bat and handed down from Anselm in many ways. And then we'll finish off.
And so, again, going back to starting points, I think it's fair to say that when the Western Church got an empire with an army and then a whole lot of institutions around that, it changed its theological perspective on a lot of things. So there are a lot of questions. No, it's a new thought. So that trajectory, I think, in the Western Church, it settles in a way that wasn't there in the Eastern Church. And I think that's why we see some argy-bargy between the East and Western Church, that once you've been adopted by an empire and you've now got an army, that's a very, very different world you're living in.
Correct. Now, of course, if we start in the New Testament and with the apostolic era, that was not the case. They were losers and outsiders and a small group. I think all I wanted to say about the epistles is that I think the apostolic era was one more of a declaration than an explanation.
Absolutely.
There was a declaration of the Messiah's come and he's changed the world and he's risen from the dead and this has forgiven our sins. Rather than, in the same way with the Trinity, they declared the divinity of Christ. In the beginning was the Word was God, was fine. They declared it, but they didn't explain it. And you could understand that the battles they were fighting were declaration battles.
Yes.
Existential. There were existential battles of declaration and probably pulling themselves apart from the Jewish womb they came out of. So little wonder they didn't have time to sit back and say, oh, that raises a good question.
Yeah.
So, but we in gospel conversations and everyone we're looking at would look back to the epistles as having the raw materials for us to work on.
Absolutely.
In the same way it did with the Trinity.
Yeah.
Although, interestingly, when I get to Anselm, it just so happens, for different reasons, that in his essay, he does not do that. He doesn't use scripture at all. And that's not to criticise him.
No, just
but just to say that was a deliberate methodological point he took. So, with that, and I think the other thing to say, which is I've just thought of this about the epistles, it probably is fair to say that the penal substitutionary theory of atonement is very based on Paul and very based on a couple of his epistles. Now, I only want to just lay this thought out for us all tonight. One thing Tom Wright said in his book, The Day the Revolution Began, was he's often wondered how different the Reformation would have been if Calvin and Luther had spent more time on Ephesians and less time on Galatians and Romans. And so that's just an interesting thought.
That is an interesting thought.
But then an even bigger thought is John, the apostle, has a very different view of what went on to Paul. And I think the theories of the atonement have been so dominated by Paul that they're overshadowed by John. I mean, I think I mentioned this to Rick Watts a long time ago, and we agreed. Actually, John's gospel has almost nothing in it about sin. It's about life and death, light and darkness. Those are the vast images that drive the book. And his images of redemption are very organic, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abides alone. And so if it dies, it bears much fruit. He saw a vast transition going on for sure, but you'd never get a penal substitution model out of John's gospel or epistles. Anyway, all that to say that I think the resource in the New Testament is richer than has been.
Yeah, and I'd bring up in possible defence of Paul.
Oh, would you?
Yeah, just maybe. I've mentioned that section in Leon Morris's book, the Apostolic Preaching of the Cross, in about chapter 8. He points out that, be careful, we probably use the word righteousness in a way that is very different to those in first century Judaism, Greece.
I think what you're saying, I think I read what you just said in defense of Paul, is that actually Paul was not really putting forward penal substitutionary atonement. His use of the word righteousness has been distorted. Hijacked.
Yeah.
Hijack's a good, yeah. Okay, so if that base of understanding, something amazing happened, something totally surprising, something that turned everything on its head. The concept of rule and authority, the concept of victory, the concept of hero, the concept of leader, the idea of sacrifice, everything got upended that day on Calvary, that God died.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
huge.
It is the most stunning storyline in all of human history, and they had to unpack it, which they did. the patristics, their theory of the atonement is often called Christus Victor. Now, and their theory of the atonement was, I'll just say a couple of headline issues about it. Invariably, they began with creation. Very powerful theories of creation.
Yep.
They didn't begin with sin. They began with the purpose of God in creation. And then secondly, invariably, the enemy was death, not sin. That's how they thought it through. So, and we could say a great deal about them. I will, however, just foreshadow this. I do hope to get someone else, Ben Myers, to talk on the patristics, because Ben's an Australian. He gave a magnificent talk some years back called The Patristic Model of the Atonement. And I thought it'd be great if we could twist his arm to, you may not, but.
And we can tell, because of the Christological debates and the Trinitarian debates that occupied the early church, that they were much more interested in the Christus than the Victor. That they were trying to work out who is this person that saves us, rather than what's the mechanism of salvation. Because if he's not who he says he is, then there's no point asking the second question.
They went into the incarnation, far more powerful.
Yeah.
And Ben disagrees with the Christus Victor, which came from Gustav, which is
Alun.
Yeah, he disagrees with it. He thinks he fundamentally misread Gregory of Nyssa, because I think the Christus Victor is there's a battle between God and Satan, and he disagrees with that. He says he hasn't read.
There's not a lot of text.
Properly. Yeah, no, it's death that's the enemy. Anyway, and death is a privation, not a reality. It's the lack of light, not light.
Yes,
that's the.
Like darkness is a privation, lack of light.
Correct. And so anyway, I think Ben's talk is fantastic, and I've invited him to come along, be part of us, and we'll see if he does. That heritage then leads us to this, as I said, pivot point of Anselm of Canterbury.
Yep.
So do you want to give your view of Anselm of Canterbury?
All right. So I boiled it down in terms of history that he had to make his response against the idea that there was a battle against Satan. He thought, no, if there's a sacrifice being made, it's not being made to Satan, it's being made to God. And then he needed a backfill. What's the reason that would be the case? And he says words to the effect, because there was a feudal, God is like a feudal lord, and when he is dishonored, someone's got to pay. And so that was he just drew from his context. And as you said, there's not a lot in scripture that would drive you down that way. Now, I think it's important, as we were discussing earlier, that Anselm comes across as a relatively humble sort of guy. And I'm not sure if he was told before he wrote this that it was going to shape a strand of theology for 900 years. I'm not sure how. Like, it's just a theory. It's just a theory, and I think it's good that he raised a theory, but it's taken on a life of its own. And what happens is, once you've got that idea embedded about a Lord who is offended, then people start thinking that's their relationship between God and us. And I'm not denying ontologically that's the case, but what if God actually was trying to treat us as more equal than that? And so it sets you off on a trajectory where you start backfilling your Bible with a whole lot of assumptions, unhelpful assumptions.
Yeah, I agree entirely. Anselm, if you read him, I don't think anyone here will, so I'll have to read it. Was humble and speculative and agile in his thinking. He's a very clear thinker.
Yeah.
But he was what I'd call rhetorical, meaning that in rhetoric you are comfortable with ambiguity. You don't necessarily, you're not dogmatic.
Yeah.
So an example of a non-rhetorical genre would be the catechism. Okay, so when you want to become when you're a candidate to be admitted to a church, there's a catechism you go through, and you get asked questions for which there are rote answers.
Yeah,
you've learned them.
You've been instructed.
It's a bit like sitting for a driving license, and they're right or wrong. Your answers are right or wrong. Now that poses as question and answer, but it's not rhetorical in the slightest. It's dogmatic.
Yep, pass or fail.
Well, it's built upon an idea that truth is a precise set of axioms. Rhetoric is, well, I'm not quite sure. I've been wondering about this, and here's how I would frame my wonderings. And what do you think about that? Where there's a genuine sense of unexpectedness in the answer, and the very question will provoke lines of thought that you hadn't quite thought of. Augustine at his best is like this, in his book on Christian doctrine, but Anselm is very much like it. And like you, I'm pretty sure he was humble. He didn't think he had all the answers, prepared to be proved he was wrong. I think he'd be a bit shocked that his view had got concretized into the total theory of atonement. But we'll come back to him. I think it'd be nice if we went straight on then into your view of how his view was then colonized, taken over by the reforms.
So I think the way the metaphor I use is Anselm creates a theory which is like a vehicle, and the engine that drives that vehicle is the idea that honor is essential to God because he's like a feudal lord, and if he's dishonored by rebellion, which presupposes an interesting order, then something's got to be done to bring back the honor, and that was Jesus' death. And what happened with the reformers over time? They looked at that 500 years, and they didn't quite like what that did to the doctrine of God. And they lived in a time where people were rethinking boundary lines between kingdoms, and people were writing constitutions and things like that. And they immediately fell down on law.
They were both Calvin and Luther were
lawyers. And so what they do is they take the engine that Anselm had put in there and replace that engine. So everything is really very, very similar, except that engine's about a law. And as soon as you say there's a law there, you've got to, as I said earlier, backfill and say, Adam broke that law. Nothing in the text says that. You'll read some places where it will say that the way Adam got the moral law is while God and Adam were walking in the garden, that's when God instructed him. And so you get this superstructure of made up stuff. So there's an idea that there is a law that even God can't do anything about. And that's called righteousness. And again, we might dispute whether 16th century law and righteousness are what was meant by God when he gave us the New Testament.
Yeah, so you're very right, first of all, just so everyone knows. I mean, honour is the word he uses, Anselm, that is, and to disobey is to insult.
Yeah,
another word he uses. So it's very, very hierarchical, his view of society. And it's the shift to the, well, it's 400 or 500 years later, but the shift to the reform world is only slight, because in the medieval era, the feudal system was both an economic system and a judicial system. The landlord could hold courts, sentence people to death, as well as he was raising, there's always a hint, taxes and fees. So there was a complete judicial and economic slavery, really, to the landlords by the common people. Now, fast forward to the 16th century, and the emphasis went into the criminal code versus the honour system, but it's extremely
still the same hierarchy.
It's the same hierarchy.
Same hierarchy.
And what, of course, is revealing I think, about, I keep thinking of Jesus's words, by their fruits you shall know them, and revealing, I mean, I've got just a love-hate relationship with Luther and Calvin. It's good not to know too much about Luther.
Yeah.
The more you know about him, the darker the picture gets. I'm reading a biography of his by Linda Roper, which is pretty riveting. But one of the saddest things is, she said, it is quite chilling and surprising how much he was a good hater. And he bitterly hated his friends whom he turned against. He destroyed their lives. And people have whitewashed that out, like Karlstadt's, a guy called Karlstadt's the big case in point. But he destroyed them. If you went against him, he was in his book called Revenge, and that was the end of you. And it wasn't like you come to him and say, let's get together, sorry about all that. People tried that with him and he wouldn't do it. So it's and then the other part of Luther's character, which is very true and revealing, is, as she said, unfortunately, whenever push came to shove and there was a choice, he sided with the aristocracy against the peasants. And the most famous example is the Peasants' War, which was awful. Because in a way, Luther's theology had fed the Peasant War.
Absolutely, yeah. Ironically,
you start talking about forgiveness, and it's a theory of liberation. I mean, it's against the shackles of the church and the nobility. So little wonder people picked up as, oh wow, the aggrieved peasant class in southern Germany were flexing their muscles. And what happened in the Peasants' Revolt, which I think lasted about 3 years, was a massacre.
Yeah.
It was a massacre. Thousands of them were massacred. And Luther was on the side of those doing the massacre.
So he didn't read Gregory of Nyssa, did he?
No, he didn't read Gregory of Nyssa.
So it's really hard to work out how you get from Gregory of Nyssa, he's talking about liberation of slaves, to a bunch of theologians 1,000 years later.
I think the answer is, very sadly, the same patriarchal socio-cultural system was in their mind. The landscape of reality, that was it. And it was unredeemed. People might say they had an unredeemed ontology or an unredeemed cosmology. And
that's fair.
Because of that, the default under pressure is to go back into that.
Yep.
And so, I mean, that's
very generous.
Well, I asked myself that if I there, but for the grace of God, if I was there, what would I do too? Because Luther did great things. He's a bit like Winston Churchill. He was good at war, but not at peace. Yeah. And but probably the saddest relationship is his relationship with a man called Karlstadt, which Linda Roper claims has been whitewashed out of most, and certainly Christian biographies. What happened was that when Luther was in, he was hijacked by the Prince, was it, of Saxony, and taken to the castle, essentially for his protection, where in that time he translated the New Testament. So Wittenberg, where they came from, was now vacant territory. So there was a vacuum of leadership of the nascent Reformation movement there, into which stepped a man who was his friend and had been a co-theological student. Probably didn't have as rich a, I think, theology or picture of what Christ did as Luther, but nonetheless they were on the same team. He took over and he started doing things in the church that all of us would agree with, like getting rid of a lot of the statues and essentially creating a more, when you look at it, you'd say creating a more liberal society out of Wittenberg.
Yep.
Declassing it and so on, and stuff that would be the natural social extension of, you would have thought, of the theology. And of course, what happened was this inevitably led, when we say peasant class, you need to include the merchant class in that, who are often running the city. But then above them all were the nobilities who owned all the land, as did the church, about 50-50 each. So the people who had all the wealth were the church and the nobility, and the merchants were tending to be using enterprise. But there was a lot of tension between the landlords who might have owned the abbey or whatever, and the merchant class. And this tension in Wittenberg was between the councillors who ran the show and were sort of on Karlstadt's side, and the princes, the prince. And when Luther came back, guess who he sided with? And he absolutely destroyed Karlstadt's career and life. So
yeah, that doesn't get talked about a lot.
no, it doesn't.
The man lived with a lot of
Peter
dissonance.
say, oh well, look, he's hard not to like. I mean, whereas Calvin's hard to like. When Alistair McGrath wrote his biography of Calvin, he had to make up the first 1/3, which was because Calvin never wrote anything about himself. He just extremely private. So he had to essentially put the first third of the book into the Sorbonne and the Paris in which he grew up, and then extrapolating. Well, perhaps he went to this lecture and perhaps he thought this. Well, we don't know because he didn't keep any diary, he didn't say anything. So anyway, the dark side of, and I haven't got onto the Synod of Dort, where the tulip came from
Tulip, yeah.
And the executions that followed that.
Yeah, no, that's not talked about very often.
Of the Protestant opponents of predestination.
Yeah.
So it's the point about this is there's this patriarchal backdrop, master-servant backdrop, out of which we are arguing that theology naturally came. Could have been feudal or might have been nobility, but it was extremely revealing that backdrop formed the imagery out of which the model of now God's relation. God must be the ultimate landlord. God must be the ultimate landowner. If I think about God, who do I think about? Well, he's not the merchant class. He's not the peasants, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Although I've kind of forgotten to take him came as a peasant. But let's get that out of the picture.
That's right.
It destroys everything. He must be like the landlord. And, we've just been through Europe. I've got a photo which I was trying to stick up on the web. Salzburg. You go to the magnificent city of Salzburg, and it's in a sort of valleys where Mozart was born, beautiful place. And right up on the hill, perched up on the hill, is the old abbey stroke castle. And that sense of a dominant mountain on which the landowners, dwelt, the cardinal, they're often cardinal and princes, was palpable. And during the peasants' revolt or part thereof, some of the merchants came forward, with a sort of sheet of demands to the cardinal, who then ceremonially burned them.
Yeah, didn't go well.
And so
the Jewish community in Europe must have been galling for the nobility, because it's such a flat structure, and it's more about family than it is about a class structure. Relatively flat. You do have a merchant class, but you don't have that sort of nobility thing running from it. And these are the people who bought the Old Testament that brought forth Jesus. I mean, I don't know if they thought about it, but it's a stark contrast what the Western world was like compared with the Jewish communities.
You just mentioned it during this evening talk. It would be very interesting to look at the Jewish idea of.
Why would you dislike them? They're just minding their own business.
So that gives us I think the big picture. What I would like to do now is I'll dive into Anselm, and because you've given us a very accurate representation of his model of atonement around dishonor and insult. So I just backfill some of that, and then we can finish it off. He's Italian. Did you know that?
No, I didn't. Really?
Italian.
Oh, because he was Bishop of Canterbury. I thought he was.
Yeah, I thought he was English. No, he was Italian. And sort of left home when his mother died, and travelled the world, and spent a lot of time in France. That's where he was obviously very bright and very inquiring, and went to an abbey in France as a visitor, but then became a monk. And in those days, it's a great life. It's like a license to read and think.
Yeah.
And that's what he did for 10 years, you know, and when they read, it was rumination, you know, they really, you've got to think these guys only had a handful of texts to read, as opposed to any other modern scholar, you know. You both can talk about it, Lisa, with Jess. But if your bibliography hasn't got 200 books in it, how do you absorb 200 arguments? You don't. Yeah. That's the answer. Anyway, leaving all that aside, he then moved to the Abbey in England, and somehow or other he became the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1093. So 60, and he never liked it. To his credit, he didn't like the pomp and ceremony. He didn't like the battles with the king. You know, he's a sort of a true thinker, a bit like Ratzinger, the Pope. I think he was reluctant. He died in 1109. Now, I talked about the sense of his character, very bright, but what's really appealing, very devotional and a mentor. All of his writing was to teach the other young people. They asked him, please write, you know, can you write this down? So very mentoring, and his view is always spiritual development, despite being very intellectual. But even as an intellect, he was creative. He didn't just regurgitate. And as an intellect, he was what I call rhetorical. And what does that mean? It means he believed enormously in the power of an argument to convince. And that I find very appealing. So he knew he was in a contest of ideas, and he was prepared to develop very creative arguments from first principles about things. So that's all nice, actually. And now, the reason why I think it's more than nice and relevant is that when he chose to, he didn't therefore point to scripture. He could have, did elsewhere, but in the essay we're talking about, which is Why God Became Man, is the essay where he developed it. He went to logic. His words were logic and necessity, not scripture. So I'm going to argue from logic. Now, people could criticize that, but I think it's really important for us today because it forces you to take your language out of religious language and start using language that makes sense to everybody. And he was doing that, I think, out of a great faith in God. If I can't find God, and if I can't argue for God from first principles, then I haven't got a God. And it's rather David Bentley Hart-like that way. And so this essay, which is quite long, about 100 pages, Why God Became Man, is structured as it's not a debate, it's Socratic, it's a Socratic dialogue where you've got somebody who's younger and a pupil, and that's Bozo, but Bozo's taking upon himself, very much like you find a very similar thing in Gregory and in the patristics, that the unbelievers of their age. And I found, to be honest with you, reading his questions was sobering in a good way. And I'll read a few of them out tonight, because I think you say, wow, I've got to get the way to think about this. Like, you're kidding. God became man. He got tired. God.
Yeah.
People say this is stupid.
Of course they do.
And it's, but the point is, it preserves the sheer astonishment of the proposition.
Yeah.
It is astonishing. And therefore, if you can't say something other than believe it, here it is, this verse says it, believe it or not, he said, no, well, I want to go deeper.
Yeah.
And by the way, Athanasius did the same thing.
Yes.
He had limits, and they're very important for us, I think, to be fair to him. And I think to understand why some of his thinking, despite his creativity, was limited, which is, number one, he only read Latin, he didn't read Greek. And probably, I don't even know if they would have had access to a Greek New Testament in the 11th century. They were using the Latin Vulgate with a bad translation. Number two, that he had no access to Plato.
Oh, really?
In the 11th century, they had none of
Oh,
Plato's
of course
text
not. Yeah.
and very little of Aristotle. So he didn't have access to. He wasn't. Whereas when you want to go to the Cappadocians, they knew Plato and the Greeks back from the Greek text.
Yep.
So he had very few books.
Yeah.
He had a very limited input to his thinking. The one he did have was St. Augustine. So we're really looking at that channel. And
it is a trajectory, isn't it?
And it does explain, I think, historically, why St. Augustine had such an influence. Because we're now looking at the 11th century, and the simple situation is they only had St. Augustine.
Yeah, wow.
Because he was in Latin and the Western Church had channeled his texts.
Yeah, yeah.
But the Eastern ones had been lost, and they didn't even have the Plato and Aristotle. So I found that very illuminating as to explain, the dominant influence of St. Augustine. So this is a man influenced by St. Augustine. Now
that is big, isn't it?
That is big. Now I'll just summarize. I'm not going to summarize all of his argument. He does it. It's so well organized. He does it for us.
Yeah.
In other words, he gives us. He doesn't give us a table of contents. He gives us the 25 in book 1 questions or propositions that he's going to answer one after the other, and the 22 in book 2. So you could just read those 2 pages and you've got the flow of his argument, which is kind of nice. But all great thinking starts with a question. All great thinking starts with a question and finding the right question. And his question, which for those of us I handed out, I've written it out, is really a fabulous question. And I think we could all pin it to the wall and think about it. The question is this. What he says is this. He said, the question is this, and he calls this the question on which the whole work hangs. So that's helpful for a start. I mean, a great thinker, if I answer this question, there's nothing else to say. Everything I say is relevant to this question. This is the question. By what logic or necessity did God become man? That is that is the incarnation.
Yeah.
But notice he says by what logic or necessity. He doesn't say by what scriptures.
Yeah.
So within reasoning, why was it necessary that God became man? That's the first question, which, by the way, he barely answers. It's a glancing engagement with it, which weakens his whole argument. Anyway, leaving that aside, and by his death, restore life to the world. Second question, and a great question.
Very good.
And I love the way he puts it. He doesn't say forgive our sins. He says restore life to the world. Unfortunately, he doesn't ever develop that phrase. If he had read the patristics, he would have more material to do it. But that's how he says it. Second question. That's the atonement question. So incarnation first, atonement second. And then the caveat, which is, you already raised one of them, really important, when he could have done it another way.
Yep.
Why? He's got to say, why was there no other way when he could have done it through another agency of another human being? And when they get into that, they start to speculate. Well, why didn't God just create another Adam with no sin and get him to do the job? Or an angel. Angel could have done it. Or, and this is really important, simply by willing it. Why couldn't he just say the sins are forgiven? That's a fabulous question.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really well structured, and whilst you can actually look at his whole essay as addressing parts of that and map the parts back to that question as to how satisfying. But that's where it begins, and all credit to him for putting it that way. I said, you're going to ask something?
Oh, I was just going to say, when we talk about a particular strand of atonement theories, but they do go off on other tangents, and they pick up on those various ideas. So I think a fellow called Grotius picks up on that third idea. Why can't God, if he's sovereign, just forgive?
Yeah.
They're great questions.
They're great questions, and none of us could. They'd cause all of us to think. They're not right answers to them. On the incarnation, where did he go? Look, I could say he doesn't say much about it. Like this essay is about 100 pages long. It gets about a page or so. And I feel sorry for him because he's almost, he begins, his real interest is the redemption and the cross. He starts with the incarnation, goes to the cross. If you were to read Athanasius or Gregory, they start with the incarnation and they go back into Genesis 1, made in the image of God. They go a different trajectory and they keep going, and they don't write half a page, they write 40 pages on what it is to be made in the image of God. So they've got a far richer creational landscape from which to move back to the cross. So that's what I would say. I mean, look, essentially, this is his answer. Why did God become man? Bozo's question is fantastic. I mean, I really love Bozo's question. It's today's question. First of all, Bozo says he's a bit frightened to ask a question of such an authority. You know, it's a very Socratic positioning. Anselm says, speak as you see fit. And Bozo says, unbelievers deriding us for our simplicity object that we are inflicting injury and insult on God when we assert that he descended into a woman's womb, was born of a woman, grew up nurtured on milk and human food, and to say nothing of other things which do not seem suitable for God, like does God actually get breastfed? He's right there. He was subject to weariness, hunger, thirst, scourging, crucifixion between thieves, and death. Oh, fabulous way to put it. I mean, you know, in our world, every skeptic, and the skepticism in our own hearts is, can really God have fingernails? Can really God be weary? Could God forget? You know, the questions are stunning once you start to think about it. If I interviewed Jesus about electricity, would he have been able to answer?
No, that's right. My daughter says she hates the line where people say you've got to put God in the driver's seat, and Jesus in the driver's seat. And she said that could go terribly wrong. He hasn't driven a mile in his life.
That's a great way of putting it. And I love Bozo's question because he captures it. And I say, wow, they were having similar debates then.
Yeah.
The power of it, the power of this is get an answer that doesn't go, oh, it says in Galatians 1, this is get an answer that actually you could talk to someone on the street about. Well, let me tell you why it matters. Now, his answer is a gap theory. It's a gap theory, which is God shows the greatness of his mercy to us by the gap between his divinity and his humanity. That's it. And you think, I think there was probably more to say about it than that. And interestingly, Bozo is not satisfied with that answer. So Bozo asked him another question, which I think is a fantastic, it's really the question for today. He says, essentially, I don't like your answer.
But there is no Bozo, is there? That's Anselm saying he doesn't like his own answer, isn't
correct.
it?
It's a fiction.
I don't like that answer.
Oh, yeah, this is it. So he's unsatisfied. He said, well, this word ransom, because he starts to use the word ransom. I'm not sure about this, but he said, people say to us, now, in what captivity or in what prison or in whose power were you held, from which God could not set you free without ransoming you by so many exertions and in the end by his own blood? I just think that is a In what
It's a-
prison
yeah.
are you held? And that's
Yeah.
really, if you can't answer that, if we can't answer that in today's terms without using religious language, we haven't got a gospel to share, and merely to kind of code that back to, oh, look, you've got problems you don't know about, they're called sins.
Yeah, that's right.
Um,
If you weren't so sinful, this would be obvious to you.
yes, and
That's right.
Bozo does imply what the prison is when he says it was from, when we say to people it was from our sins and from his own anger and from hell and from the power of the devil that God ransomed us, then they're not listening. So that question is, I think, a riveting question for us to find new answers to. I've thought about that. I went to a wedding, it was a gay wedding, some time back, of a relative of ours. I felt awkward during the whole thing, but I was, very loving, happy for the people. I love them. But I just kept like, what gospel, if I had the chance to stand up in front of this crowd and talk about Jesus and the gospel, where would I start? What would I say to them? How would I find the language to talk about, how would I position the problem? And I think that there's not one answer. That's an Act 17 Mars Hill thing, but
Extreme.
Bozo was onto that. And the answer that Anselm gave was essentially only that the incarnation was only necessitated by redemption. His reasoning is a sort of a flat reasoning that you read it through and think, yes, but it's not. He's just repeating things. It's what it's what I call it's sort of sequential logic thinking without depth behind things. So I won't keep going too much longer because obviously it gets dense, but let me look ahead and see. Yes, when Bozo actually says you have to prove in what you say that there was absolutely no other way to get us out of whatever prison you think, except by this mechanism. There can be no, and
which is more important. Why is that mechanism necessary? Is more important than the nature of the prison at the end of the day, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and yes, why was the mechanism necessary?
Yeah,
and that's really explain the problem better.
Yeah,
that's what Bozo is saying. Explain the problem better so that we can see there was no other way. Explain the problem in such a way that the only key into the lock of that prison had to be God died. Nothing else would get me out of that prison. And we would say, when I was reading Anselm, it's very clear that I think he would have been enormously helped by having your theory of dominion, and he would have had a stronger answer to Bozo's questions. Because if I was rewriting this, I'd keep Bozo's questions, but I'd beef up the answers by not so much a theory of sin. You've already described exactly where he gets to, which we'll finish on in a moment, but I think he would have had so much stronger answers if he'd have been able to talk about the lost dominion. Because what Bozo keeps driving for is, why was the logic of the cross so necessary? Why couldn't he just, boom, by decree, by fiat, intervene with everything and start all over again? Why? And of course, within the created order, he would have blown his project up, because within the project, as you've said, humanity had to have freedom. Now, whilst this is complex in a way theologically, it's not complex for anyone who's a parent.
Yeah, that's true.
Or anyone who's a teacher.
Yeah.
Like, if I'm trying to teach somebody in experiential learning, I can always jump in because they're doing it wrong, and I jump in, and there's an instinct for every teacher or parent. I want to jump in and intervene and do it wrong, and then it's all like, it was not okay because you don't grow. And that's just a microcosm, really, of the answer as to Bozo's question. If he did intervene, the creation project's finished. The Dominion project's finished. But when he came, you described his discussion of sin quite adequately. It is amazing. It is amazing to read through the pages where he talks about this honor system, because it's chilling and it's sad that's what but so clearly in the back of his mind, he has the feudal landlord, and he does do exactly what you said, which is, I'll just finish on this point because it's critical, which is we must define what sin is.
Yep.
If we're going to talk about how God forgives, then we have to define what sin is. So that was, I'll just go to my notes, which is where he goes on to what you said. This is vital, because you've defined sin for us as the four, not believing God wanted good for me. Here's his words. He said, we must see what it is to sin, first question. This is Anselm, and what it is to give satisfaction for sin. Straight away, that word's a giveaway.
Yep.
Satisfaction. And Bozo's now very humble. He said, it's for you to demonstrate and for me to pay attention. So now he's going to stop asking questions. And he said, this is it, if an angel or a human being, a man, were always to render to God what he owes, he would never sin. That is the definition. It's a negative definition.
Yeah, that's right.
Don't do this.
Don't do this.
Okay.
Yeah,
there's nothing positive about it, about a mission or anything. But
there's no purpose.
But there's no purpose. And the language is, if you think, hang on, this is the language of a peasant working in the fields who's got to pay taxes and entry fees.
Yep.
And he must always render to the landlord what he owes.
Yep. And everything will be okay.
That is the definition. Not rendering to the landlord what he owes is the definition of sin. And he doesn't change it. Everything flows out of that definition of sin. And Bozo says, I cannot contradict this. Pity, Bozo.
Yeah, Bozo, you're doing so well.
Doing so well.
So,
why did you throw some more questions?
So Bozo is Anselm. So this is why I think people say Anselm's relatively humble, because he knows he's not doing a very good argument. Because Bozo says such clarifying comments.
He does, but here Bozo.
But now he throws in the towel.
Bozo's throwing the towel in, and it's all okay. And then Anselm then says, then to sin is nothing other than not to give God what is owed to him.
Yeah.
That's it. So yeah, we can all see that tucked in behind that is a mental model and landscape of this peasant class vassal,
yep,
with a landlord. So it's going to go downhill from here, and I don't think we need to go any further to that. But if I don't do that, then he introduces the language of insult.
Yep.
So you've got a picture of some upstart young peasant who sort of says, up yours to the landlord as he's driving past in his gold carriage. And well, that's the end of it. It's an insult. He's going to get his head chopped off. The language of honour and insult is not casual. It's absolutely central. He doesn't go outside of it. He doesn't introduce other concepts. He's a victim of this feudal concept, but that becomes his picture of God.
Yep.
That's the critical point. That has framed his picture of God. And he doesn't get out of that. And so I suppose as I was reading that, what I thought about was another essay, one by Bulgakov, I think I meant to say, on St. Augustine, when he was essentially doing something very similar in his critique of Augustine's predestination concept, which is scrape it back, and Augustine's God is a despot.
Yep.
That's what Bulgakov said. Augustine's God is a despot.
Yep.
And there's no other way around it. And he mightn't like it, but that's where absolutely everything. And you say the same thing with Anselm. Scrape it back, and he's God's a landlord from the noble classes. And Bulgakov's criticism is this rather polite understatement. This is an inadequate way to represent the relation between God as creator and the cosmos. And so I think that's from that we can say the same for dear Anselm. As I say, for whom I had a lot of affection as I was reading it.
Yeah. This whole thing takes me back to something we said a few months ago now, that everyone will say they believe God is angry on occasions and is loving. And so the question for us, because everyone can say those two things are true, is God essentially angry and a feudal lord and has occasion to be loving, or is he essentially loving and has occasion to be angry? And when Bulgakov says you can peel back the onion layers and you find that the Augustan God is
essentially angry.
I reckon Augustine would be horrified by that, because he'd want to say, no, he's gracious and loving. And the question you've got to ask is what's essential to God and what's an accident? Is he essentially loving and it's just accidental or incidental because of the way we behave that there's cause to be angry? Or is this guy a feudal lord and he's grumpy?
Augustine would be horrified if you pinned him on it.
Yep.
And Bulgakov is smart enough to know that, but he knows that is the trajectory of all of his thought. Yeah. And that's where it's coming from, but he won't admit it. And
the guy didn't have Greek and he didn't have Hebrew.
Well, neither did Augustine or
Anselm. So it's just really interesting now. We're supposed to have Greek, and those people who are, father of the church or Western church.
Well, the great irony is that in the Reformed tradition, which is sola scriptura and study your Latin and Greek, the great heroes did not do that. Yeah. They wouldn't have done well at more college.
They wouldn't
have. Okay, so I think that's a good time to wrap up.
Yep.
We'll continue on now. Let's just finish by saying that the next thing we'll be doing will be the conference with David Medley Hart.
Yeah.
In August. We're looking forward to that very much, which means that the next Cross and Creation journey will be sometime after that.
Indeed it will.
Thank you, Andrew.
Okay.